Hello, everyone. My name is Cody Jordan, and I'm here with my group, Miss Sullivan A, Miss Lowry G, and Mr. Pratt K. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of ethnic cleansing and global migration. This is a very history rich topic, unfortunately, that dates way back to the beginning of most human interaction. Even after hundreds and thousands of years, ethnic cleansing and global migration still affects our modern world today. Here we have our first slide and our first question. What do most people think about when they hear self determination? Self determination is where a group of people form their own state, nation, and choose their own government. They have their own beliefs, they try to develop their own culture. This could be through dedication, commitment, it could be tasks that are getting done and passing laws. Self determination also makes an individual feel they have the ability to not give up, to continue their own actions, like they have a chance or a way to influence the environment around them. It gives them a stance. So how can this self-determination be seen as an enemy of freedoms it is intended to protect? Well, self-determination can be seen as a double-edged sword. For positive influence, it can mean great things: a new culture, a new way of life, freedoms for people. It allows everyone to have the choice in developing their government and managing things around them. Um, Hence the term freedom. You have the freedom to do things. If you're determined to, and it's within ruling and it's positive, then it can be done. But also, it can be evil. One example of this, of course, could be Hitler. Hitler and his Nazi regime didn't like the Jews and others that disobeyed their ruling and how they handled things. So in return, he created genocide. He killed a lot of people. He pushed them out. And he's known as one of the worst individuals in our history today. Another example of something bad would be, for example, the Rohingya and the Rakhine. The Rakhine were natives to Myanmar. They didn't like the Rohingya. So they eventually started to threaten them. They didn't like their culture, didn't like the way they speak, and it became a big issue. So, who are the Rohingya? The Rohingya are Muslim immigrants that migrated to lands within Burma, also known as Myanmar. These lands were not hostile at first, and they were accepted with open arms, but eventually were seen as a plague and cultural issue to the natives of Myanmar, known as the Rakhine. The Rakhine at first couldn't do a whole lot. England owned the area of Burma, so at that time, the British saw the Rohingya as a good ally, a positive influence of people, so they got to stay. They felt safe. They felt like they had someone in their corner to protect them. But eventually, due to World War II, the British left and Japan took over. Things went a little bit south here. Japan started to enjoy the Rakhine more than the Rohingya. So in turn, the Rakhine had a little more control. They threatened the Rohingya. They felt like they could do things like push them out of their lands, push them from their homes, and they felt like it was possible because Japan would kind of look the other way at the time. But they didn't have full power, not until January 4th, 1948, when Japan eventually left and Burma became its own independent country. At this time, the Rakhine had full control, and at that moment is when they started to create their own form of genocide by threatening, killing, and evicting all of the Rohingya out of the country as much as they could. And those that did stay lived a very, very tough life. They didn't have citizenship, they didn't feel safe, they always felt like they had to look behind their backs. It was just not a good environment for them. Here we continue on with our question on the next slide. So in slide 2, how have the Rohingya Muslims been contested over the years in Myanmar? As mentioned before, British ruled over Burma starting in 1823. They gave a peaceful stance, and for the most part, to all of the Muslims of the Rohingya. This was contested, though, as World War II pulled them away and resulted in the Japanese taking control. So the native Rakhines had a stronger bond with the Japanese than with the Muslims, which made it very difficult for the Muslims to gain any citizenship, to have any stance within the country. They didn't feel like they were a people anymore there. And eventually, because that British backbone left, they were kind of just left there to struggle on their own. The worst part came in 1948 when Burma did gain its independence, and that's when they started their own essential genocide, killing, doing forced migration, pushing the Rohingya out, making them feel like they can't live there anymore, giving them no citizenships, completely taking away every right they possibly had as much as possible. This left roughly 200,000 Rohingya to be pushed from their lands, and 140,000 of them were displaced among the countries around them, which created even more tension because it had all these refugees, all these people that just got pushed out, and then these new countries that were accepting them for the most part, they had to make new homes, they had to try to supply them, they had to make more food. It was just a mass evolution of just change within that entire region as all this was taking place. So how can excluding or persecuting others help make a group's sense of identity stronger? Going back to the early example that I used of Hitler, which is another great example, unfortunately, for this, his influence and the way he persecuted and killed and stood up to his ruling of let's get the Jews out, let's get those that don't abide to our culture out, made the Nazis, the regime that was around him, believe him. They felt like he was one, if not the best leader they had at the time. He was holding up to his words, he was doing what he was saying, and at that time that gave his group sense of like identity a boost. He had a lot of bad people around them, and he was a bad individual, and that made everything even worse for those that were not involved or didn't want to partake in what he was doing, or even those that were just different in general. But when Burma gained their independence, it was like an adrenaline shot to their sense of identity. They felt in complete control, and because they had this control, they made every possible effort to push the Rohingya out by killing them, by forcing them away. And once again, Burma felt like they were able to control their own destiny. They had their own culture back, and they did it in the worst way possible, and they prevented any type of immigration from really taking hold in that area.
Compare the events of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar with the events which played out in Rwanda and just recently with the Kurds. How are these incidents similar or dissimilar, and what is the correlation between global migration patterns and genocide? All three events had inhumane acts that resulted in the forced removal of the Rohingya, Kurd, and Rwanda immigrants. However, the ethnic cleansing of Myanmar is different from the Rwanda and Kurd ethnic cleansing. The Myanmar was the aggressor towards the Rohingya, and the people in the Kurd and Rwanda ethnic groups were the victims. They involved racial and religious differences and political extremists who gathered the masses to revolt against those that were different. There was also a huge split between immigrants and natives, to a point where rules and regulations would remove all citizenships and rights from a culture. The sad difference between the three is that some ended in more bloodshed, while others had a longer lasting effect politically. What is the correlation between global migration patterns and genocide? One main correlation between global migration patterns and genocide is that cultures tend to stay together as a way of comfort by having those of similar values around them. This tends to be normal with migration because of these comforts. Genocide does this through horrible acts of inhumane killing and torture, which forces migration of those trying to survive and seek asylum into other countries. These groups gather in one location, typically as settled refugees. Global migration also involves people uprooting themselves from the current home and leaving everyone and all they know to seek better opportunities in other countries. Genocide follows this pattern too, but uses forceful means through oppression and killing.
So question 3 reads, Kate Cronin Furman, a scholar who studies mass atrocities, observes that when nations are defined around a majority ethnic group, that can lead to a sense of siege, a belief that the majority status needs to be protected, because if it shrinks, the claim of the majority on the nation could as well. In your own words, summarize what Cronin Furman might mean by a sense of siege. Where else in the past or recent history that you have studied has a majority felt a sense of siege and acted upon that feeling? What can you learn from studying events such as the attacks on the Rohingya people? Well, the first question is, what does the term sense of siege mean? Well, what she means is that when a specific group that holds the majority of the weight in that country starts to feel threatened by immigration, increased immigration, and a different culture inflicting on their land or possibly infringing upon whatever cultures and things they have in place, that can create tension. This tension can lead to race conflict and religion conflict, genocide, etc. This can even lead to that specific country creating immigration laws that potentially limits the amount of immigrants that can enter the country that do not share the same beliefs as the majority in the country. I think at this moment, Kate is trying to warn people that if a culture majority group ever feels threatened, that this could possibly lead to retaliation towards those people. Where else in the past or recent history that you have studied has a majority felt a sense of siege and acted upon that feeling? Well, one very recent example would be the Russian attacks on Ukraine. As we know, Ukraine, it identifies as its own separate country. However, Russia does not view it as that way. They feel that Ukraine is theirs, and they want Ukraine back. As we know, they want to convert all of the people in Ukraine to follow their beliefs, their values, their traditions, etc. And Ukraine has fought against this sense of siege and has taken arms to fight against Russia. Another great example of a sense of siege in modern history that most of us have studied would be the invasion of Nazi Germany on several other European countries that surround it. And we saw that they were extremely discriminatory towards Jewish people, and we saw a genocide stem from that. So in conclusion, what can we learn from studying the attacks on the Rohingya people? Well, firstly, we can learn that when groups become too strong and when they gain too much power, they can take advantage of the minority groups that they could be affecting. In this case, they were affecting the minority groups in their countries. And we can also learn that preventative measures and warning signs are extremely, extremely beneficial when dealing with situations such as ethnic cleansing. We also can see that people in power need to be held more accountable, and that people in power can do more to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. And they can also do more to assist when these situations are ongoing. We can also see that international coverage is not there. We can also see that the attention is not always put onto these extremely, extremely dire situations. I'm not sure about you, but I was not informed about what was going on in Myanmar. And when I found out about it, it extremely disgusted me. And it was saddening to know that I did not hear anything about it in the news. So the news coverage is usually not there for these situations. So we need to do what we can to spread awareness as individuals. And we also can see the impact that these situations have on the children that are involved. We can see that these children in the minority group in this situation was stripped of their culture, and they are thrown into a completely alien civilization that they know nothing about, and they are forced to learn a alien culture that they know absolutely nothing about, and they might be taught customs that they might not even agree with. So in general, a sense of siege has a huge role on ethnic cleansing.
On this slide here, on slide 8 and slide 9, you're going to have our terms and their definitions. Here it's just going to discuss all the terms and the different definitions for each one, just to give a better idea of what we were talking about in the earlier slides, kind of what our PowerPoint entailed. A lot of these terms were used throughout it, so feel free to look through it here and see what these two slides have to offer on these terms. And finally, here we have our final slide, slide 10, which is our works cited page. Here we have all the resources, the documentation that we use to put into our PowerPoint. Feel free to click on any of the links that'll take you to the articles so that you read about each topic. There's even the topic that we went over earlier in slide 6 about Ukraine, which is what's happening currently in our world and all the problems that are going on with that. So enjoy.